Welcome everybody to this last lecture of this series of this online course. So my name is Lucas Foppa. I'm working at the Nomad Novel Materials Discovery Laboratory in basically applying artificial intelligence methods to material science and in specific catalysis. And this is a bit what this talk will be. Actually, today I would like to share some of our very recent research applying artificial intelligence methods that you've heard of during this lecture to catalysis. So this is um, this is what this lecture is going to be about. So there are three parts. So I will start with part one, where with some discussion on the why do we need artificial intelligence in heterogeneous catalysis, or do we need artificial intelligence? What can we do and what can we not do with natural intelligence? And in part two, I'm going to discuss this, what is called identifying materials genes of catalysis from clean experiments. And this will hopefully become clear what we mean by materials genes and clean experiments. And here, I just beforehand, I already tell you that we are using the artificial intelligence approach, symbolic regression and compressed sensing, which you heard of during the lecture from Luca Ghiringhelli. In part three, we are going to talk about these groups of outstanding catalysts from high throughput experimentation and theory. And here there are two things that are important. So the AI approach we're going to discuss is subgroup discovery that you were introduced by Matthias Scheffler. Here we are going to discuss this idea of bringing together experiment and theory. So this is this is the title of the presentation, this fusion idea. Then we're going to discuss this there. So before we start, I would like to ask you to we have time at the end for questions and answers. So this is fine. We're going to have some time for that. But you can also, I would like to encourage you to raise your hand and unmute yourself simply during the talk if you have questions or if anything is not very clear. So you can just interrupt me and we can discuss at any point during the presentation. So feel free to do that. Okay, so do we have any other thing? Did I forget something? I think this should be fine. Okay, so now let's move to the part one. So I will start with an introduction on catalysis because we have a heterogeneous audience here. So let's do this. So what is heterogeneous catalysis? So basically, what we learn in school and what is the common simple understanding on catalysis is this is a process that is enabled by this material, which is the catalyst, which is a solid that enables a reaction between some molecules that we would like to transform into others. So in this case here in this scheme, we have this A, B, and normally here this G means that they are in the gas phase. So this is why we call it heterogeneous catalysis, because the material, the catalyst, is in a different phase compared to the reacting molecules. And we would like to transform this into other products, and mainly this is because we would like to have a more value-added product. So these are probably something that is not very useful. So the idea of the catalyst is that it will, so in this energy versus reaction coordinate plot here, and this reaction coordinate we can think of as, for instance, a bond being broken or something like this. What the catalyst will do is to actually lower this barrier that has to be overcome to transform the reactant into products. And this is by means of a different reaction pathway. And this is an intermediate species here, C, which we're going to talk about. And so what basically the catalyst does is to enable this reaction without being consumed. And this is often represented in what we call a catalytic cycle, as you have here on the right, where we start with a surface site, normally represented by this star here, where the reactants will adsorb, and then they will be activated. And this means that their bonds are going to be broken, for instance. This is what people call activation, forming different species in this surface. For instance, this C star species, which is an adsorbed species. That's why we put this star here. And these things that we form on the surface of the catalyst will rearrange and diffuse on the catalyst and will eventually form other species D, which will then desorb, and this is the product we are interested on. So this is, and here we close the cycle, we go back to the surface site, and then the process can start again. So this is basically what is the very basic principle of heterogeneous catalysis. And but I have to tell you that there are three main requirements for a catalyst to be useful, which are first, activity. So how much this catalyst will enable this transformation and at what rate. The selectivity, which is actually a very crucial issue, which we're going to discuss next. Which is the how much of this the product we are going to form, the product of interest, compared to other products that can be formed in this reaction. So there are byproducts which are not necessarily interesting, and we want to form selectively only one of the molecules, for instance, in some applications. And finally, the catalyst has to be stable, so that it can be applied in an industrial plant, for instance. It has some requirements on stability that are very important. So let's dive into this selectivity issue, and we are going to discuss this in the context of a specific reaction that will serve for the illustration of these AI approaches later. So this reaction we are going to discuss here is the propane oxidation. So propane is this first molecule here. It's an alkane. This molecule is very abundant, and we would like to transform it to something else, because there's not much we can do with this molecule the way it is. So we would like to transform this, for instance, into propylene, which is this molecule here, or to acrylic acid, which is this molecule here. So here I'm showing the equations that show the formation of these two molecules, propylene and acrylic acid. And here you can see that this first molecule will react with oxygen, which is another reactant. And then we will release water, forming this olefin, so this molecule here, or the acrylic acid. However, we also have the possibility, when we have this alkane with oxygen, we have the possibility that CO2 is formed, and this is the total combustion product. And this is, of course, undesirable. And the big thing here, the big issue, is that this is the thermodynamically favored product. As you can see from the enthalpy of the reaction, this is very favorable to form CO2, and we don't want that. So we want a good catalyst that has to enable the transformation of the initial propane to propylene and acrylic acid without producing CO2. So this is why the selectivity here is it's an important issue. So why do we care about this acrylic acid? So this is this molecule is used for the production of polyesters, coatings, paints, adhesives, and supersorbents used in diapers, for instance. So there's a lot of applications, and you can see here from this the way the molecule looks. We have this double bond here and this acid function. So it's a very versatile molecule that can be used for several applications. And second reason is that the formation of this acrylic acid is an example of a very complex chemical reaction. And there's a lot of chemical research, a lot of fundamental research to describe the formation of this molecule in oxide catalyst. So let me explain you further why this is so complicated to form this acrylic acid. So first, we have very complex surface reaction networks. So when I show this first catalytic cycle with one intermediate, this is rarely the case. In real system, and especially in the case of this reaction, we have a series of reactions that can take place. And here I'm showing you, we don't need to go to the details, but the way these surface reactions can be complicated. And here, for instance, just from propane to propylene, this is a part of this reaction network. You can see that several things, several ways or pathways will lead to the propylene. And also from propylene, you have several possibilities. So this makes the situation very complicated and much more complex than these simple cycles that we normally draw to understand catalysis. So this is the first point. These surface reactions are very complex and interconnected. Second, the catalyst, we represent in the catalytic cycle by this star, and this is something that is the same entity during the whole catalytic cycle. But in reality, the catalyst restructures under reaction, and this is a phenomenon that is often referred to as catalyst dynamics. And here in this graph on the right, I'm showing you an example of how this happens. So here I'm showing some results from experiments. So this is a near ambient pressure X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy operando experiment. So this means that during these experiments, we are looking at the constitution of the surface of the catalyst. At the same time, we measure the rate of production of certain products. And here in this graph, we have the amount of surface vanadium on this catalyst here as a function of time on stream. And on the bottom here, we have the CO2, the acrylic acid production. So at the same time, we know the surface composition of this catalyst, we measure the production of this molecule. And here we see that depending on the feed that we apply, so the feed can be wet or so it contains water or dry, we have a different composition on the surface. And specifically when we have steam on the feed, we have a higher amount of vanadium on the surface, and we produce this molecule of interest, this acrylic acid. Whereas we have dry feed, we don't produce this molecule anymore, and the surface composition is different, and we have lower vanadium on the surface of this catalyst. So this shows really that the catalyst structure and the reactivity are interconnected, and they depend on the feed, on the reaction environment that this catalyst is experiencing. Finally, we have to think that these catalysts are normally in pellets, and they are in the reactor. So this is like a representation of a reactor, and the flow goes from the top to the bottom. And inside this, the solid here, we may have also some barriers for this molecule in the gas phase to get in contact with the active species in the catalyst. So the molecules, both reactants and products, they have to diffuse to the surface site so that the reaction takes place. And here is an example of, for instance, the molecule has to enter in the structure of the catalyst. And this is also something that, so the result of the reaction and the selectivity will depend on this phenomena too. Finally, we not only have all these very complex phenomena, but they all couple. So we have the coupling of this above mentioned phenomena and others in different time and length scales. And here you see this graph. I'm showing that on the y-axis you have time, and on the x-axis we have length. And all these phenomena that can take place, so the phenomena, so the reactions at the active site, the restructuring of the catalyst, and we have others that we don't mention here so far, so segregation or sintering, and the transport of the reactants and products. So this makes the situation very complicated. So how can we tackle that? So first thing we can think of, and actually this is done very since some decades now, is to use first principles methods, atomistic simulations to understand this. However, the first principles explicit modeling of the full catalytic progression is often unfeasible, and we have to rely on assumptions that are sometimes not well justified to do this modeling. So the idea is that we start from a atomistic model like this. So for instance, here we model this reaction, and we then build on this to model something, the other processes, so the diffusion and absorption and everything. So this can be done, for instance, by means of ab initio thermodynamics or kinetic Monte Carlo methods. And so we have a lot of theory for that, especially developed also in this institute. And then starting from that, we can go to the higher length and time scales and try to model this whole thing. But yeah, so far this is very, so if you think about these reaction pathways, for instance, this already evaluating the reaction networks at good accuracy, it's something that is not trivial for computations or for first principle simulations. So what else can we do? So experiments, as I showed in this picture, they provide very valuable insights on how the catalysts work, but the problem is that they focus on particular catalysts and particular conditions. So, for instance, in this case, it's unclear if the phenomena we observe for this catalyst here also applies for other catalysts. So one may wonder how generalizable are these the findings that we have for one specific system. So because of that, it's unclear how to derive quantitative and general relationships between all of these things that play together. The catalytic performance, which depends on the materials properties, for instance, structural or electronic, which also depends on the reaction conditions. So this is all interconnected in a very complicated manner. So this is where the idea of using artificial intelligence comes from. So what do we want to know with this? Why do we want these relationships? Well, we would like to know first what phenomena govern reactivity. We would like to understand the principles that are driving this selectivity, for instance. We would like to know which kind of properties matter most for this reaction, or which techniques we need to use to measure these properties. And finally, we would like to know which materials to look next, right? We would like to start from a set of materials and to have some guidance on what to look next. So this is where artificial intelligence would come into play. And here, I just point some of these challenges that have been discussed very frequently during this lecture. We have material science specific challenges here in applying artificial intelligence methods. And first, we would like to understand the underlying process. So this is as important, if not more, than predicting new materials. So we don't want to use methods that are black box, and we would like to get some physical insight from this modeling via artificial intelligence. Second, we have a trade-off between the number of materials that are experimentally analyzed and the amount of information per material. So we can either consider a large amount of materials and a small amount of information per material, or we can have few materials and have a larger amount of information for them. So this is a situation that is similar to what we have in first principle simulation of materials too. And third, we have the issue that the interesting materials are exceptional. So we would like to model something that is very specific, and we are interested by we are searching for the very specific materials that have extraordinary performance. So this makes things a bit more complicated. So this is why we would like to use. And here I'm going to show in this presentation the two examples where you're going to see some of these things coming back. Okay, so this is part one. So I would like to, let me check. Yes, is there any comment or question so far? Okay, if this is not the case, I will continue to this part two and discuss these material genes that of catalysis and what that means exactly. Okay, so one of in this work here, we would like to address some of these, finding these relationships between performance, materials properties, and reaction conditions. And here, one of the approaches we propose here is to combine clean experiments and artificial intelligence. So this is what we would like to do here. So let's start with this clean experiments. What does that mean? So we start from 9 vanadium-based catalysts that are used for oxidation reactions, which are shown here. So these are the 9 materials. And we prepare and test them in propane oxidation using standardized and annotated procedures. And this is all described in this publication here, towards experimental handbooks in catalysis. So we prepare according to these standardized protocols and very in a controlled manner. And this is what we call clean experiments. So everything is annotated and everything is done at the same, using the same procedures for all the catalysts. So why is this so crucial in catalysis? Why do we need this very standardized procedure? So I'm showing here an example of how this can be crucial. So this is the same catalyst as I was showing before, this MOFTE. Here, so the point I want to make here is that the reactivity that we measure, it depends on the catalyst chemical memory. And what does it mean? We have so if we measure this selectivity to acrylic acid, which is how much of the molecules are initial molecules are converted to acrylic acid with respect to all the products, as a function of the propane conversion, which is how much of the propane has been converted, we have different results depending on how the experiment is performed. For instance, if somebody starts measuring at this temperature to 225 and increases the temperature and increasing therefore the conversion, this person will get these results here in this blue line here. However, if somebody would start the measurement at 400 C, so starting with a higher temperature, and then go decreasing this temperature and therefore decreasing the propane conversion, this second curve in purple would be obtained. So, and this is for the same material and the same reactor and the same conditions actually. Here you have this 1000 is the gas hour space velocity, so the which measures the flow of the reactor with respect to the catalyst. So you see that this selectivity will be very different. So what happens here is that the catalyst is dynamic and it's transforming according to the reaction conditions. And specifically, when it comes to 400 C, the catalyst, the material itself is already different from the starting material. That's why we have these different results. And that's why it's important to really annotate how this experiment is being performed. And actually, this is the reason here we prepare the catalyst and then we activate the catalyst at high temperatures before we measure the reactivity. So this is done for all the catalysts. So this is an example of how crucial this the way the experiment is performed is for catalysis. Okay, so once we prepare this catalyst and we test, but we also characterize these fresh and activated samples. And here, these are some of the techniques that we use to characterize this. So it's a very detailed characterization that includes common characterization techniques such as X-ray diffraction, nitrogen absorption, which gives, so the X-ray diffraction gives some information on the crystal structure, nitrogen absorption on the mesostructure, so the polar structure. Then we have other techniques like X-ray fluorescence and etc. XPS for surface properties. And we also use here, importantly, at this point, advanced characterization, which are techniques that measure the catalyst properties under reaction. And here we use this microwave cavity perturbation technique, which measures the conductivity of the catalyst. And importantly, we use a near ambient pressure X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy, which measure the surface properties of the catalyst at different feeds. And here we use 3 feeds, which are dry, wet, or C3 rich feed. So we get all of this. So we test the catalyst, we characterize using all of these techniques. And then this is when the artificial intelligence approach comes into play. We have therefore generated a consistent data set of targets, for instance, the acrylic acid selectivity, and of what we call primary features, which are the input features for our modeling, which are these 49 bulk and surface properties of the catalyst. So this is a lot of information per catalyst. And so what we do with this consistent data set, then we apply the sure independent screening and sparsifying operator approach, which is based in symbolic regression, to find these explicit analytical equations relating the key primary features among all of those and the target. So this you heard already about this CISO approach, and I will just give a very short recap on that. So what we are doing here is the following. We use first, CISO has 2 components. The first one is the symbolic regression based feature construction. And in this step of the algorithm, we combine the primary features that are those properties that we measure from the catalyst according to mathematical operators, for instance, addition, multiplication, power, etc. We do this iteratively and systematically. So for instance, if we have 2 variables, x1 and x2, we apply these operators and we obtain more complicated expressions. And then we do it again using these features. So this is done recursively to obtain even more complex expressions. So we create a huge amount of candidate descriptors, which are then selected according to using compressed sensing, according to their fit to the data set. And here, so this is done in 2 steps. So first we have the sure independent screening, where we look at the properties of these features, the candidate descriptors, how much they are correlated with the property. we select those that are mostly correlated with the property, and then we use L0 minimization to find these expressions of this type here. So where this we have different dimensions. This D here is the number of dimensions of the descriptor, and these coefficients are fitted. And yeah, we do this as and as O step the number of times that we need to get different dimensions. So first we look at the correlation to the property, and then we look at the correlation to the residual, which is the difference between the model and the property. So the second dimension would be this step here. And then we construct these models for the property, which have this expression. So this is an interesting approach here because it's effective with a small number of materials. And actually, the big data aspect here is in the size of this candidate descriptor space and not in the input number of materials. So we have this candidate descriptor space have billions or more elements. And second, because of this, because we are using symbolic regression and because of this sparsification, we have an interpretable descriptor in the sense that we can look at the expression obtained in the end and understand which are the key primary features that appear there. And these are what will become the genes. So in this specific work here, we are using leave one material out cross-validation to assess the complexity that we need for each of the models. And we are using something called multitask CISO, described in this second publication here, which is a transfer learning approach that allows us to simultaneously take into account all the measured temperatures during the catalytic test. And this is what we use in this case. So here I'm showing you the measured acrylic acid selectivity as a function of the temperature. So it was measured during different temperatures. So we see here that this catalyst has a very high selectivity for this product. And we have also these other catalysts, so this which have different profiles here. So this molybdenum vanadium oxide, this VPP, or this vanadium oxide. And we have also these 4 of the catalysts that are shown in gray here, which do not produce any acrylic acid. So selectivity is equal to 0. And this here, I call your attention to the fact that we have different types of behavior in the data set. And this is crucial for the artificial intelligence method because the algorithm needs to be informed about both good or desirable performance or undesirable performance to find the reactivity patterns we are searching for. So that was the experimentally measured result, and this is what. So this is the type of model we find with CISO. So this is a model for acrylic acid selectivity, which is composed by 2 descriptor components. So the descriptor is 2-dimensional, so D1 and D2, and here we have these coefficients C1 and C2, which are depend on the temperature. So we have 1 coefficient per measured temperature. And this is the fit of the model. So in the process shown here, the model fit compared to the data set. So they are all here. So we see that the fit is quite good. The model is able to capture this behavior here and also the other high temperature selectivity, for instance, here. And we can look a bit more in detail how this model is composed. So we have this that D1 and D2. They are the components. They have some values for each of the materials, and this is shown in this graph here. So here we have the D1 value or D2 value for all the catalysts in the data set. So the 9 materials, and we see that they have very high value for the MOF, the catalyst, which is by far the most selective towards acrylic acid. And then they have other values for, so they have no finite values for the other materials that produce acrylic acid. And they have practically 0 value for the materials that don't produce any acrylic acid, which are these 4 here. So this is how the model is constructed. Is C1 times D1 plus C2 times D2. So this D1 and D2 are shown here, and the coefficients depend on the temperature. So based on this model, what can we do once we find this model? So we can create maps of catalysts according to acrylic acid selectivity. And this is what is shown in this graph here. So here I'm showing the D1 in the y-axis, so the value of this descriptor component as a function of temperature. And here in this graph, each of these lines correspond to one of the catalysts in the initial data set that we use. And the color code is goes from 0 to 100, is correspond to the predicted acrylic acid selectivity in percentage. So here, what can we see? So we see that there is this catalyst that has a higher selectivity, which shows up here, and the other catalysts that have lower selectivity that appear in this region. And we see here which are the interesting regions that we would like to, where we would like to go to find new materials. Because so we have basically to increase the value of this D1 so that we reach these areas which are the most interesting. So this map is telling what are the interesting areas of the material space where we need to go. But we not only want the map, actually in this case, so this is the point I've shown before, we would like to understand what is going on there. So we can go further and look what is actually the expression of this D1. And this is shown here in this new slide. So we have an analytical expression for D1. So we can go there and check what is here and to identify the key primary features that reflect the process that trigger, favor, or hinder selectivity. And this is what is shown here. So we have different properties. So I'm going to just go through some of them. For instance, the pore volume of the fresh catalyst shows up here in this square. So this was measured by N2 absorption. The property here is the pore volume, and the underlying process that this is capturing is the transport of reactions and products. So back to what we discussed before. The second primary feature here is the activation energy of bulk conductivity. So this may be reflecting some bulk charge transfer that is needed for achieving this selectivity. Then we have the work function measured under the wet feed, that this is measured by near ambient pressure XPS. So this is related to an underlying process of charge transfer. So this is what this primary feature is capturing. Then we have other features here, for instance, the amount of vanadium on the surface and here. And this, so this is related to this catalyst dynamics that we discussed before. So the amount of vanadium on the surface is captured here. And yeah, then why do we care about this and what is important? Well, vanadium is the redox active species of the system. So this is why it is an important parameter. And finally, we have here other properties that were measured by laboratory XPS, which relate to surface carbon content and type. And these can be related to some kind of surface sensitivity. So what is happening, the type of surface sites that are needed for this reaction to happen. So this is how we can get some understanding from this descriptor, not only the map, but also the underlying processes. Well, once we have understood what is important, we can now use this map to imagine new catalysts. And for instance, we can imagine how we could modify the catalyst of the data set to get a better material. And here I'm showing an example of this VPP catalyst, which is a vanadium pyrophosphate. We could imagine increasing the pore volume of this catalyst and decreasing the activation energy of conductivity. And for this experiment, we imagine that we can keep all the other primary features constant, and this is what the selectivity of this catalyst would be according to the model, the CISO model. So we see that we would go from this VPP would go from this line here to this line, and we would increase significantly the amount of the selectivity towards acrylic acid. So this is the way we imagine these maps of materials being used for the design of new materials. Okay, so we're reaching the conclusions of this part 2. So I'm just going to summarize some of these points that we have discussed and the important things before we go for the Q&A and break. So first, we have identified here models for real catalysts. So we are really looking at the real performance measured in the reactor. And so we identify these models, but not only, we also have the key parameters, which we call materials genes, and techniques to be used for catalyst design. So this is very valuable information for the experimentalists, for instance. This AI approach only requires a number of materials that is synthesizable by experiment. So we are talking about much less number of materials compared to widely used artificial intelligence techniques that you've seen during this course. And this represents an alternative strategy to model these complex materials functions, which cannot be explicitly addressed by theory. And so this this is a way of handling these very complex materials functions where we cannot really tackle the whole complexity by atomistic simulations, for instance. And here I leave you the reference for the paper discussing this work. So in case you're interested, you can also already access this preprint of this paper. And yes, and this is how we end this part 3. Okay, so we come back to this the third part of this talk.
Lucas.
Yes.
Hi. So I wanted to ask one thing.
Yes, sure.
That came up. I mean, just to start a bit of discussion. I know part of the answer. No, I mean, yeah. The idea was this thing that you mentioned at around the very end, that you can tweak some property. I mean, theoretically, you tweak some of the property of the material, and you show that then you can improve its selectivity. But how feasible is that experimentally, in the sense that typically features are correlated, right? So it's a nice insight, but how is that useful?
Yeah. So here, yeah, this is a good point. It's also regarding the synthesizability. This is also something we didn't discuss here. So the idea is here that is to see in which direction we would like to change the properties. So we identify the key ones and see what are the kind of rational things we can do to improve the catalyst. So here, so in this specific case, we are changing the pore volume of the material and the like the conductivity of the material. So this we can imagine that we can change the two at the same time because they correspond to different length scales of the material. So the pore volume is something on the mesoscale, whereas the conductivity is something intrinsic to the bulk of the material. So we can imagine changing both simultaneously. But how this would impact the other features, this we don't really know, I would say. And it's kind of complicated sometimes to say that because, for instance, we cannot really intuitively think about the composition of the surface under the reaction, right? Because this is something that requires some very special measurements. So I would say some of the properties, yes, they will, we can tune independently. But yeah, at this point, we don't really know how this would affect the other properties. I don't know if you would agree, but
well, yes, that's true. Thanks.
Actually, the pore volume here is something that has been tried before, and there is some literature on people trying to tune this property. So let's say, it makes sense that the model tells to go in this direction. This is in line with what people tried with chemical intuition before.
Yeah, I guess that then imagine that one produced a new material, then one has a new data point at worst, right? And then see if that improves.
Yeah, I think the idea here is that the model tells you in which direction you go, and either you will find like a better material indeed, or you will just get a new data point in a region where you didn't have a lot of information. So you gain in any ways.
Yeah, thanks.
Any other comments so far? Otherwise, I think I'm just going to go to this third part, and I will let's reopen for discussions later. Okay, so here, so I'm going to talk about these groups of outstanding catalysts from high throughput experimentation and theory. So as mentioned previously, here we're going to start discussing this idea of having both inputs from experiments and theory. So in the previous example, we had just experimental data. Here we're going to have both. And this is a different setting compared to the previous example, and it's concerning the different types, the amount of materials and the information we have per material. So what is the idea here? So we have a similar reaction here. So this is propylene selective oxidation to acrylic acid. So in this example, we start with the olefin, so this molecule here. We oxidize it, and we would like to obtain this acrylic acid. And the type of materials we look at are mixed metal oxide catalysts. So they are composed by these 4 metals or semi-metals, plus phosphorus and oxygen. And here you will see that this is like somehow similar to what we had before, especially in this MOFTE catalyst. It's a combination of different metals. So this is what the target catalyst we have for this project. And what is the goal here? So we would like to identify these promising compositions and reaction conditions that will give high acrylic acid production. And here we are going to talk about acrylic acid production rates instead of the selectivities. So as usual, we not only want to find these patterns, but we would like to get some understanding on the reactivity. So we would like that these parameters that we identify, they are chemically meaningful somehow. The strategy here is a bit different. So we start with high throughput experimentation. So we have these setups of parallel reactors that can perform a lot of different experiments simultaneously. So catalysts are prepared and tested with different compositions and temperatures in this case. And this generates a data set that we would like to analyze by artificial intelligence to identify these key parameters associated to this outstanding performance. So we are looking for the exceptional materials, basically here. And the idea is that we have, once we identify these parameters, we can come back with suggestions to what we can look for experiment. And this is a bit related to Luca's comment. We would like to say what are the next data points, where they should be taken, and what are the promising compositions we should look at. Okay, so this is a bit of the background, and this is the data set that I'm going to spend some time talking about. This data set that was generated by high throughput experimentation. So these are the catalysts. So here I'm telling you that the M1 actually is this tungsten, and then we have ruthenium here. And then we vary this M3 and M4, so these 2 metals that we have. So how this is a bit about the data set. So we have materials with 3 metals, so the tungsten, ruthenium, and M3, and then materials with 4 metals. Then we have M3 and M4. And this is the number of data points. So here we are talking about much larger data sets compared to before. So we have 200 or 500 materials, data points, sorry. The number of materials is 29 and 44. So we have more data points because each material is measured at different temperatures. And this is the type of M3 and M4 we screen. So these are the elements that we include in the catalyst composition. So this is we not only have these different metals that are tested, but also the compositions are changed. So the tungsten composition goes from 0.3 to 30%, in this range. Then we have also different range of compositions for M3 and M4, and the temperature goes from 200 and 400. So this is like all varied, and this makes the situation very complex. And here I'm showing you the acrylic acid rate of formation on the y-axis as a function of the amount of M3, so the M3 composition, the XM3. And here we see that, so each of these data points is one catalyst and reaction condition. And we see that most of the things that were tested, they correspond to rather low acrylic acid production rates. So most of the materials, they are in this range here. And we are looking for these materials here, which have this outstanding performance. So we have a large amount of materials and conditions measured. We have little information on materials properties, so we know their composition. That's basically the information we have. And we have only few materials or conditions that have an outstanding production rate, for instance, larger than 0.3 millimoles per hour, which are those here. So this is what we would like to find. So we would like to find patterns defining this outstanding performance. So what do we do here? So you heard about it, subgroup discovery before. I'm just giving you like a short recap on that. So the idea of using subgroup discovery here is that, especially because we would like to focus on these exceptional materials. So the idea is that we will identify relevant parameters and selectors. I will tell you in a while what this means, defining special subgroups of the population. So how does it work? We start with a data set where each data point is associated with a target property value. So in our case, the target is the rate of formation of acrylic acid. And we have a lot of these features that describe these materials. So this can be a property of a material or a parameter related to a material. And we have a lot of them. We would like to use subgroup discovery to find the coordinates in which the special materials with outstanding characteristics will be separated from the rest. And so in principle, we don't know which coordinates are these, and subgroup discovery will find regions in this, we'll find the coordinates of these maps according to which we have these subgroups defined. So, and what we not only find these coordinates, but we also find these selectors I mentioned, which are the rules that define these subgroups. So for instance, here in this example, we see that these red dots are the, let's imagine that they are subgroup, and then subgroup discovery will find the coordinates here and these thresholds that define this subgroup. And this is what we're going to do. So if the outstanding characteristic here is the high performance, and if these features that we use to generate these subgroups, they are known for new materials, then we can use the selectors to design. So we can use these rules to find the new materials that we have to test next. This is the idea here. So subgroup discovery has two crucial aspects, as you can have realized here from this example. First, the features. So we use a set of input features that are these parameters related to each material and condition to construct these selectors that define the subgroups. So they have to be chemically meaningful to be useful, and they have to differentiate the materials, so make it capture the patterns that we are looking for. And second, we need what is called quality function. We need a function to measure how outstanding this subgroup is. So this outstanding criteria will be defined by this quality function. And so once we have defined the features and the quality function, then the algorithm of subgroup discovery will search for subgroups that must maximize this quality function. So what we're going to do is to generate subgroups defined by selectors, so several selectors, 1, 2, 3, or more, and then we are going to search for subgroups that maximize this quality function. This is what we are going to do here. Okay, so in this specific example, what do we use? So the target is what I showed you before, so the experimentally measured acrylic acid production rate. So this is the target we're interested on. Regarding the features, here we are going to use two different types of features: experimental features and calculated features. So we have these 30 parameters that come, for instance, temperature. This is the temperature using the experiment. The composition, that is something that we know about the material, so how much tungsten, ruthenium, phosphorus, or etc. have. So this comes from experiment. And now we are going to use some parameters that come from calculation. So we are going to take elemental atomic features that are properties of isolated atoms. So they don't depend on the atom environment, only on the atom itself, the element, that were calculated by density functional theory. And these properties are, for instance, the radius of maximum electronic density for s, d, or valence orbitals, the energy of highest occupied states or lowest unoccupied states, electron affinity, the ionization potential, and electronegativity. So these features are supposed to tell something about the chemical nature of the elements, and that's what we're going to use here. And we use these features weighted by the composition that we have. So this line here. So we just take we apply this expression. So we average them by the composition. We also use the average of elemental features without so simple average here, and the standard deviation of these elemental features. So this tells how much different these elements are that enter in the composition of the catalyst. So this is a bit of the idea of the fusion here, where we use both inputs from experiment and calculation. Okay, so this is what I'll talk about the features. Now we have to talk about the quality function. So this is how the quality function of subgroup discovery is defined in this way, in this word here. So it contains two terms here. The first term is what we call coverage, which is the size of the subgroup over the ratio between the size of the subgroup and the size of the population, which is the whole data set. So this term controls the subgroup size, and it's here. So this is the first part of the quality function. The second part is here. It's what is something is called cumulative Jensen-Shannon divergence. So what is this thing here? So this is a quantity that will quantify the dissimilarity between two distributions. So this is defined in this equation here. So this is a symmetrized version of the Kullback-Leibler divergence here, which is also called relative entropy because of the similarity with this Shannon entropy that comes from information theory. So this is how we are going to evaluate. So we are basically looking all over the distribution to see how close they are in this sense of this metric here. So by having this, and here we apply the cumulative divergence because it's more convenient for the subgroup in the context of subgroup discovery because this varies more smoothly. And so by using this quality function, we are searching for subgroups that have the distribution of target property as different as possible with respect to the population. So the larger this measure is, the more different is the distribution of the subgroup with respect to the population. And here an example of how this works in practice. So I'm showing here simply two Gaussians just for illustration on how this quantity will change as a function of the distribution. And here we see, so this is the value of the Jensen-Shannon divergence for these two distributions. So this is 0. If we shift the center of these Gaussians, we see that the value of this divergence will increase. So quantifying that these distributions are different. So this is one way that where this the quantity will get a higher value. And also if if the distribution have a different narrowness, we are also impacting the value of this divergence. So this means that the subgroups we are searching for are either shifted somehow from the population, or they are narrow. They have a narrow distribution. So this is what we are doing by choosing this quality function here. And I note that most of the data we have, not only in this application but several, they correspond to low performance material. So most of the things we know they are not exceptional, or they are not high performance materials. So it makes sense that we search for subgroups that are as different as possible from this bulk of materials that have low performance. Okay, so this is we talked about the features, we talked about the quality function, and now we go to this the results and the kind of subgroups we have with these two setups. So here I'm showing the population. So in blue, so we have 746 data points for this in this case, and the subgroup we find. So this is not the best quality, but I hope you can see here. This is the acrylic acid production rate in this axis, and the amount of data points we have. And we see that most of the materials in the population, they are very low performance. So we have a very low acrylic acid production rate, whereas this subgroup we found here has contains mostly materials in this range here. So the materials that have a higher acrylic acid production rate, which is what we are interested for. So this subgroup does contain these high performance materials and conditions. And now we can look at this the subgroup, how we can visualize the subgroups in these plots that are shown here. So we have here the acrylic acid production rate in the y-axis, and here we have on the x-axis temperature, or the amount of M3, so the composition in M3, or the average of RD, which is the radius for maximum d orbital value. Density value. And so here you see that these points in red are the subgroups, and they do correspond to the materials that by eye we imagine to be the exceptional. And we can also look at the elements that we have in there. So in the group of materials with only M3, we have tellurium, and then we have this combination of this element to molybdenum, niobium, and antimony. And yes, so if you see some similarity of this with the MOFT catalyst, this is not by coincidence. So we have the subgroups, and as I told you before, we also have the selectors. So these rules that define these subgroups. So here are the selectors for the subgroup. This subgroup we found here. So the temperature has to be higher in the subgroup is higher than 355. So this is what's shown here. The amount of M3, so the composition in M3 is higher than certain threshold, as shown here. And this average of this radius is lower than this threshold. So the material has to be composed by elements that will make up this average lower than a certain threshold. And so how can we understand a bit what is going on here, or what is behind these patterns that we find? We can look at, for instance, these RD values of these different elements. So, and here we can see that, for instance, these elements here, they will have much lower value for RD. So that's why we need one of them in the formulation. And we can start thinking about how this compares to something we know chemically. For instance, the way the bonding of these materials is achieved with oxygen and phosphorus, and we can start rationalizing what is the chemical principle behind this performance. Okay, so once we have these selectors, as I said before, we have these rules, and we can apply these to find new promising catalysts. And this is only possible because we used features that are calculated from DFT, so we can access them for materials or elements that were not even used in the experiment. So this is what we are doing here. So we take all of these 41 metals and semi-metals that we have in the periodic table here, and we look at the 861 possible M3, M4 combinations, and we look each of these combinations, which of these combinations will give this RD average lower than this threshold. And this is what we get. So, well, only one material has M3. So with one M3, it's only tellurium, and then we can combine these three materials, these three elements, for instance, or one element from here and one from here. or one from here and one from here. So these are the combinations that will enter the subgroup that we found according to the rules given by the selectors. So we can identify not yet tested elements which are part of the subgroup of outstanding acrylic acid production. And that's how we can suggest like which new formulations and not only the composition in terms of the elements, but also how much of this M3 we should have or the temperature for new experiments. Okay, so I will just wrap up this part now, which was shorter than the first one. Yeah, and so just like some thoughts on this part. So we have these chemically meaningful parameters and rules defining the subgroups of outstanding acrylic acid production, and we identify this by subgroup discovery. And here I have to say that this is we are focusing really on the outstanding materials. So if we would use a global approach to model this, we would probably not be very successful because most of the materials that we have are low performance and we do not want to focus on them. Second, these features that we use here, they can be calculated for unseen elements. So we have rules to identify promising new M3 and M4, so new compositions. And this is the advantage of using theory combined with experiments in this example. And so this is basically the idea of this fusion of experimental and computational data by artificial intelligence. So modeling some complex properties is hard for theory alone. So as in catalysis is the case, and we have a lot of other examples where this is very complex. But predicting the new materials by experiments alone is also hard because we would have sometimes, if we use experimental input, we would have to synthesize the materials and measure the properties before we can tell it's a good or bad material. So this is where theory and experiment can come together to accelerate the material discovery. So this is the whole idea of this fusion. And I hope I could show you some how this can work in practice. Finally, I will just leave this list here of all the people involved in this project and the people that triggered, favored, and hopefully didn't hinder a lot the project, and especially the inorganic chemistry experimentalists that work with us at the Fritz Haber Institute, people in the NOMAD laboratory, and as you can see here, we are also working with companies, so BSF and HDI, especially for this high throughput project. So, and I also have to thank NOMAD and the Swiss National Science Foundation for funding. So with that, I will like to close this third part of the presentation. And with that, I would like to open for discussions.